Hello, everyone. My name is Nan Roman. I'm President and CEO of the National Alliance to End Homelessness. I want to welcome you to the fifth and final session of the Alliance webinar series, Researching an End to Homelessness, Policy Ideas for Election Year 2020. This webinar series has been a group of wide-ranging discussions on what research tells us would help to end homelessness. I want to thank Joy Moses and her team. Joy is the director of the Alliance's Homelessness Research Institute for putting the series together and all of the speakers that have participated in it. We're finishing this series on a high point with a discussion with two incredible housing researchers, Dr. Chris Herbert, Managing Director of the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard University, and Dr. Algernon Austin, Senior Researcher at the Thurgood Marshall Institute at the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. They are both going to speak to us about their work on the broader issues of housing affordability, to supply and demand, and we'll discuss what they see as promising approaches to solving some of the nation's affordable housing problems as we move into the election. And they're going to make presentations, and then we'll have plenty of time for discussion and Q&A from you all. I hope that just as we move along, it would, I think, work best if you would put the questions you may have in the Q&A box, and we'll be selecting questions from there to ask our presenters about the solutions that would help us reduce homelessness. So Chris, I think we are planning to start with you, so please take the floor.
Great, thank you, Nan, and it's terrific to be here with you. So what I'm going to do today is share with you some of the Joint Center's research around housing affordability trends. This will, given the nature of your audience, I think probably not necessarily be news, but I think it's helpful for framing our discussion. So just to start, looking at long-term trends in the shares of renters who are facing cost burdens. And the American Community Survey, which we use for this, has just come out this month, so we're able to update the trends through 2019, which is the latest year available. The headline here really is, as we came through the first part of this decade, we saw an enormous rise in renter cost burdens. The share of renters spending either more than 30% of their income on housing, the standard definition of cost burdens, or even those who are severely burdened, spending more than half their income on housing. And you can see from 2001 up through 2011, that though the number and the share of renters facing cost burdens rose dramatically from about 40% at the start of the decade to 51% in 2011. After 2011, as the economy got on better footing following the recession, we saw that share of renters who were cost burdened started to come down. You'll notice that the number of renters who were cost burdened kept going up through 2014 as this huge surge of people into renting was kind of combining with the share who were cost burdened. To me, that number kept inching up to about 22 million by 2014. And since then as well, the number who are cost burdened has gone down. But this is one of those instances where if you look at the year-to-year change and say, oh, the share has come down, the number has come down, you lose track of the fact that this increase in the first part of the decade was so significant and the improvements have been so modest that we're still in a situation where we're much, much worse off than we were in 2001. So the 2019 number, as I said, just came out. We're still at about 21 million renters who are cost burdened, nearly 11 million of whom are severely cost burdened, and 46% of all overall renters. And so, I think the answer is we've seen some improvement and we've had a very strong economy. So it wouldn't be surprising we would see some, but really not much at all relative to how big the problem had gotten. Other key point about trends in cost burden. So I just said that the share of cost burden renters has come down since 2011. But if you look then by different income strata, you can see that for most income strata, the lowest income strata aside, there have been steady and continual increases in the share who are cost burden, even since 2011. So between 2011 and 2019, for example, if you look at those making $30,000 to $45,000 a year, there the cost burden share has gone up from 50% to about 57% over that time since 2011. It's gone up among people making more than 45,000. It's gone up among people making 15 to 30. Only among the lowest income households has it not gone up, and there the share was already at above 80%, and so there's little ability for it to go up. So a key factor here has been that even though we've seen some improvements in affordability, it's felt worse because people up the income scale are more and more likely to face these burdens. Now, having said that, I would also not lose track of those bars on the left-hand side for people making less than 15,000. Again, the shares there are by far the highest, particularly for the share who are severely cost burdened. More than 70% of those renters are paying more than half their income for housing, and their income isn't very much to begin with. And if we look at the numbers of renters who are severely cost burdened, 8 of the 11 million are in that lowest income category. So even as much as the Joint Center is responsible for spreading the story that cost burdens have been democratized and moving up the income scale, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that it's still most significantly a problem for the poorest households. So what's behind these trends of affordability, even the declining affordability or not much improvement in affordability, even as we've seen the economy improve? And really on the supply side is where we have to look. And this chart is showing you the numbers of rental units in 3 different price buckets: under $600 a month, 600 to 1,000, and above 1,000. If we go back to 2007, those 3 segments of the market were roughly 1/3 of the market each. And so that really kind of divided the market into the three segments. Since that time, what we've seen is that the share renting for more than $1,000 has gone steadily up to about 45% of the market now, where the share renting for under 600 has gone steadily down, particularly since about 2012, when these trends became more significant, and that down to less than 1/4 of the market now. And so what we've seen is that this strong flow of renters into the market is meeting a really limited ability to add new supply of housing, particularly adding workforce or affordable housing. And what that's doing is pushing up rents on all the existing units as well. So we've seen rents go up across the board. And this is a dynamic that's actually playing out in moderate cost markets across the country. The biggest areas where we've seen this loss of low cost units have been in the heartland of the country, where these very affordable units, now $600 a month, what that means is if you're making $25,000 a year, it would be affordable, which is essentially for people working full-time year-round at the federal minimum wage or so. A big shortage of supply, reflecting the fact that the market has been very constrained in adding new supply, pushing rents up across the board. This is just the trend in homelessness, so top level numbers of homeless. And really since 2014, we've seen the unsheltered homeless in particular rise, and the rise has been significant, particularly in Western states. And this, our work is trying to document how this relates to rental affordability. And here, this is a simple scatter plot. Along the x-axis is what share of renters are cost burdened. So the states to the right have the higher share of cost burden. And then the y-axis is the homelessness population ratio. How many homeless are there per 10,000 population? And there's a strong positive correlation with the states that are having the most rental affordability, also marked by having the highest rates of homelessness. So these issues are clearly intertwined, whether or not there's affordable housing available. And if not, it just exacerbates the issues that produce homelessness. And just to touch on the pandemic, we're getting ready to write our State of the Nation's Housing Report, which is coming out late this year because we were trying to figure out what the State of the Nation's housing was earlier this year. And one of the headlines is just how the pandemic has really exacerbated affordability challenges that existed before the pandemic. So this chart is just, again, showing you the shares of households who are cost burdened among renters. And on the left-hand side by income, again, that point I made about the fact that this is most significant among the poorest households. And on the right-hand side is showing you by race and ethnicity, and the shares of households who are cost burdened are particularly high among Black and Hispanic households. And then if we look at the share of renters in the Census Pulse survey who are saying that they're behind on their rent payments, this is the Census Pulse most recent one from week 16, you can see that there's a strong correlation between income and, again, race and ethnicity. So while about 15% of all renters are saying they're behind on their rent, 26% of Blacks, about 18% of Hispanics, 20% of Asians, so much more concentrated among people of color, and it's likewise much more concentrated among lower income households. So what we're really seeing in this pandemic is a housing affordability crisis that has been heavily concentrated among lower income households and people of color, and the pandemic has only exacerbated that. So I know we haven't yet, I think we'll use our conversation to get into policy responses, but let me stop there and I'll turn it over to Algernon for his introductory presentation.
Okay, wonderful. Let me share my screen. Great, wonderful. So I will be revisiting some of the points that Chris has presented, but just in a longer time scale. But generally, looking at the broad problem of our inability to provide adequate, affordable housing. Oops, 1 sec. I am maybe sharing the wrong thing. Let's see. Okay. Great. So before I begin, let me say that my remarks today are my own. I'm not representing any organization with which I'm associated. I'll be drawing primarily from a policy brief that I did with the Demos think tank titled Affordable Housing for All. So if you want some more details about anything that I speak about today, that's a good place to look for elaborations on my points. So first, I just want to emphasize something that you may all be aware of, that providing affordable housing to low-income people is not possible within the private market. It's not possible for the private sector to do this. The economics simply doesn't work. So to have housing that's affordable for low-income people, we need government subsidies. That's the only way it's possible. And it's, of course, it's very important for the government to subsidize housing for low-income people, because when you do this, you have a much healthier society. Both socially and economically, the society is healthier. I mean, people are literally healthier in terms of their health outcomes, educational outcomes are better, employment outcomes are better, probably crime rates are lower. So it's really in the public interest, in the interest of the common good, for the government to provide affordable housing to everyone. So the question is, why is it that in a country as rich as ours, that we have two, the Urban Institute in this slide says there's two scarce government subsidies. And this slide is just referring to a great little application that the Urban Institute does, where you can really look at some of the costs of building housing and why it doesn't work, why it's not possible to provide it at a cost that's affordable to low-income people when you factor in all the other costs in terms of building it and maintaining it. So now I'm going to look back. While Chris gave you the current picture, I'm going to take us back to the 1960s using data from the Joint Center for Housing Studies. And this is the share of cost burden renters by income quintiles. The top quintile, the top line, the blue line, is of the poorest households, the bottom fifth of renters. And also these are the renters that are probably most at risk of becoming homeless. In 1960, you can see that nearly 2/3, 65.6% of these renters were cost burdened. And I consider that to be a failed affordable housing policy. That's an incredibly large share of our poorest households. They're the poorest households, and yet they're spending a large share of their little bit of income on housing costs, which produces a great deal of stress on their families and their communities. So I consider the situation in 1960 to be a massive failure. But as you can see, going forward, things have only gotten worse. In 2016, we were over 80% of the poorest households cost burden. And as Chris was just mentioning, those cost burdens have been trickling up the income distribution. So we see that for the lower middle quintile, the gray line, it was almost a quarter in 1960, and 2016 it's more than half. And for the middle quintile, went from about 4% to nearly a quarter. So this is, as I said, just a massive failure in my view in a country as rich as ours. So why is this? And I would argue that the federal government is really not trying to provide affordable low-income housing. When you look at our housing dollars, how we allocate our housing dollars, you find that it disproportionately goes to high-income homeowners and not in inadequate amounts to low-income renters. So as the slide indicates, a larger share of our federal housing spending goes to the 7 million households with incomes of $200,000 or more, and more than 50 million households with incomes of 50,000 or less. More than 70% of our federal housing subsidies go towards homeowners, although renters are more likely to have severe housing cost burdens. And if you looked at the wealth profile, homeowners have a lot more wealth and generally also more income than renters. So we're really funneling our housing dollars to the most advantaged individuals in our society and not to the least advantaged. And nearly 3/4 of needy renters receive no federal housing assistance, while all who qualify for home ownership tax breaks receive them. So this is a real, people describe this as an upside down housing policy because we're giving so much to the wealthy and so little to the needy. When people talk about the problems in our sort of the misallocations in our housing dollars, people often focus on the home mortgage interest tax deduction. And I agree that that's a very bad, problematic, wrong-headed policy, and it deserves the criticism that it gets. But I think the low-income housing tax credit probably doesn't get a sufficient amount of critical attention. So my issues or the problems that I see with the low-income housing tax credit is first that it's a tax credit. In essence, it's being run by the IRS and not out of HUD. It's not responsive to it's not truly responsive to affordable housing needs. It's responsive to the needs of investors. So as the investing climate changes, as tax policy changes, the amount of housing you get from the tax credit changes. And those issues are not housing issues. So our housing policy should be directly responsive to our housing needs, not to tax policy changes, for example. The other problem with the low-income housing tax credit is that the affordable housing that it creates expires. So it's typically required to be affordable for about 30 years. And that means that, as some say, it's a leaky bucket. The problem of affordable housing unfortunately has been with us for more than 30 years, and it will likely continue to be a serious issue for more than 30 years. And when I did the report for DEMOS, at that point, I believe it was the Joint Center for Housing Studies, predicted that there were 500 million low-income housing tax credit housing units that were at risk of loss. So that's a problem. We need affordable housing, and we shouldn't be losing it or having it be at risk at the rate that it is because of the tax credit loan. The other problem is that the low-income housing tax credit is not that affordable. For the households that are most at risk, that are probably most at risk for becoming homeless, often can't afford the housing that's being created from the tax credit. If you were to compare the low-income housing tax credit, housing choice vouchers, and public housing in terms of which of the three are most effective at reducing cost burdens. The low-income housing tax credit is the least effective of the three, and yet that's the one that we're relying the most on right now to produce our affordable housing. So these are three of the reasons, and there are other criticisms of it, where I think that we really should end this tax credit and really allocate the amount of money that we would normally be spending through the tax credit to housing choice vouchers or to social housing. So what do I mean by social housing? So simply, social housing is affordable, high quality, long-term housing, and it can be structured in a variety of ways. And it is structured in a variety of ways in many other rich countries across the globe. Our public housing, unfortunately, if you look into the history of it, you'll see that it's structured both in terms of the physical buildings and in terms of the way the maintenance and funding has been structured in ways that lead to declining quality. So it was sort of structurally impeded from being long-term, high-quality housing, and that's a real problem. We really should get rid of the restrictions that we place on public housing in the United States so that it can look more like social housing that's very popular in many other countries across the globe. And similarly, the other thing that you can notice from these charts is other countries generally do more and invest more in social housing. So social housing represents a significantly greater share of their overall housing stock. If we had social housing on the scale of any of these other countries, we would do a great deal in terms of addressing the affordable housing crisis that we're facing today. And I will end there. And thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much to both of you for those great presentations and for the research that you've done to arrive at those presentations that help us understand, I think what we see on the homelessness side anyway, see the results, obviously, of these tremendous shortages in affordable housing. How do you think, I'll just ask a few questions and then we'll pick up some questions from the Q&A. So if you have questions, and I see some coming in the chat, but it's better if you could put your questions in the Q&A. I think that would help us. We see some in homelessness, certainly, and I think nationally, we see some changes in the demographics with the aging population. The estimates on the aging of the homeless population is that we'll double the number of aged people who are homeless by 2025 and triple it by 2030. I believe that's the figure that we get from Dennis Culhane at University of Pennsylvania. So how does that play out in terms of housing and housing supply? The other thing I notice is, or I wonder about, I guess, is in cities like DC, for example, where I am, there's a lot of building of condos and smaller ownership and rental units for millennials. There are a lot of big houses in the suburbs, but if the older population starts to die off and the millennial population starts moving into single family homes, what is the supply, the affordability supply going to look like then? So how do those age demographics impact the issue of the affordable housing shortage?
Maybe I'll start, Algernon, and you can jump in. I mean, the aging of the population is a huge issue, and it is going to stress our housing system in a variety of ways. I think one of the things is that there's a lot of people who are also working, who are not necessarily eligible for housing assistance, but when they hit retirement, aren't prepared for retirement. And so I think we are going to see a lot more need and a lot more eligibility for assisted housing among older households And we haven't done anything, to Algernon's point about the lack of federal response. Certainly, there's been very little federal response in terms of housing specifically devoted towards older households. Section 202 and Section 811, which for folks with disabilities, had been no additional funding. They recently put some funding in there, but it's modest in comparison to the growth in need. So, you know, Nan, one of the issues here is that there's a tremendous need of affordable housing across the spectrum. And I think we do tend to segregate this and say this is housing for the elderly. The elderly have long been viewed as the deserving poor. And so there's been a lot of places that have devoted resources specifically for housing for older folks. The Joint Center has done a lot of work on the implications of aging, and we certainly are sensitive to the fact there's going to be an incredible need here, but I think we do have to look at it holistically at the need for younger families as well. So we need a broader housing policy response, but one that really is sensitive to the growing number of older households who will be in need of stable housing. And as you said, with the consequence without it of growing homeless population among the elderly, which is just not how anyone would want to spend the last any years of their life, but certainly not when you're elderly and frail.
Yes, and I would just throw in there before I turn it over to you, Algernon, for your thoughts too, that the healthcare costs of allowing older people to become homeless are high and easily can offset savings in the healthcare side could easily be devoted to the housing, to supporting people in housing. But as you mentioned earlier, Algernon, we just don't choose to do that here. Anyway, your thoughts about the aging population?
No, I think the response so far has been great, and I just want, as I was saying, that the benefits, as you're drawing attention to now, the benefits of providing affordable housing includes health benefits. Yes, for seniors, but also for children. Children who are homeless aren't going to do well over the life course also. So it's a tremendous social benefit to provide affordable housing, and we should. And like you say, it can, it ultimately will benefit the society as a whole, and it may very well pay for itself. So we do need to do much better around this, and we do need to really mobilize. I think we need more of a political movement, because the interesting thing about this problem, and we've seen this in the slides, is that it's not simply affecting the poorest households. The problem of the housing affordability pressures. We've seen it in both of the presentations, that it's moving into even into the solidly middle income households. So there is a broad impact across all the demographic categories you can imagine, but I think people are still thinking about it as a personal problem and not sufficiently as a social and political problem that requires a social and political response. People are thinking like, I can't make my rent, not that as a society we're not adequately providing affordable housing. And to address this, we really need to mobilize the society and say, hey, this is important. This is one of our critical problems that we need to address.
Nan, we didn't address your question about linking to millennials. And just briefly on that, I would say is that, the older population, many of whom are well housed, but are going to be ill housed as they get older, lose the ability to drive, become socially isolated. Those folks express a desire to age in place, and which I think most people recognize as a desire to age in community, to maintain those social ties and connection with the place where they've lived. And what that means is you need to have diverse forms of housing in communities that are now predominantly single family, where a lot of older folks live. And what that would do is create an opportunity for them to stay in community and free up that housing for millennials who are at this family stage of life. So there are ways in which we need to think about the broad spectrum of housing available and where it's available to accommodate the needs of both older households and then free up housing for younger households.
Yeah, I just wonder too about how much of an exchange there's going to be between the units that millennials free up I mean, people do want to stay in their communities sometimes. Other times people, you know, want to leave the suburbs and move to the city when they're older because there are more conveniences in many ways for them there. And how these things are going to match up in terms of supply. We may have, you know, too much supply in one arena and just not anywhere near enough supply in another that we're not really preparing for, I guess.
Right. You know,
that exchange.
There is a peak millennial who's now about late 20s, but behind that is a very long, flat age structure. So in fact, as much as millennials will ebb a little bit, there's still a lot of rent. So I don't think we're going to see a decline in demand for rental housing in the city. But I think we are going to see a need for more suburban housing because, as we've seen with this pandemic, millennials are starting to push out in the suburbs, and that's going to need a supply response.
So
have you?
Nan,
Yep.
In your question, I was wondering if you were suggesting that there would be this reversal, that the younger households would move to the suburbs or wherever into the larger homes, and the older retirees will move to the cities. So you would have this kind of a flip. And I'm not sure. I mean, I think Chris can better answer this if those numbers actually balance out. But I do know that for sort of younger people of color, who are the younger generation is disproportionately of people of color, they are less likely to be able to afford homes. You know, there's a much higher rates of student debt, lower income. So individuals may want to move to a bigger house in the suburbs, but often can't afford, don't have the finances to be able to make that move. So that's one possible bottleneck in that sort of swapping of real estate.
Yeah. There's so many factors. I mean, also, I suppose if there's less demand in the suburbs, the prices might go down. You know, it's all a numbers game. I'm just looking for insights about how that, you know, maybe just praying for something that might work in our favor for a change. But perhaps that's not there. Let me ask you this. We've heard in some cities that there's just a feeling that there's a COVID related flight, that people are leaving. Have you seen any data on that, or do you have any sense of that? That might result in rents in cities going down?
I've read a couple of articles, but I think it's just, you know, this recession, this moment that we're in, is really bifurcated between the high income and sort of everyone else. So there are people who are fairly wealthy who are saying, okay, I need to buy a home out of the city. And people who have the opportunity to work from home can do that. They can move. They can say, okay, I used to live in New York City. I'm going to move upstate. But there are lots of individuals, again, who just can't afford that. They're stuck in place. They can't afford to buy a house in the suburbs, and you know, the house prices at least in certain metropolitan areas, are going up right now because of this, I suspect. But also other people have to work. They're quote unquote essential workers. They have to go into a physical place to work. So they can't telecommute. They can't live anywhere. They have to live in commuting distance from where they work. So it really differs by socioeconomic status of how people are responding to the pandemic.
I think at this point the information is mostly anecdotal, Nan, and it's, you know, along the lines of Algernon is saying, we're all reading the same articles in the paper. You know, the data that we would rely on will come out with a lag, so we'll know better in a year or so from now. But the anecdotal information all does point to much greater demand for housing in the suburbs, and it's really intersecting with the demographics. So we're at a point now where millennial generation is centered around age 30. So there's a good chunk of those who are in their 30s. They actually are married and starting to have kids. Many of them have stayed in the city longer than previously, but a lot of these stories about people who have a couple of kids, now they're like working from home, studying from home. And what might have been a process that would unfold over time is unfolding more quickly. But as Algernon said, I mean, I think it's not necessarily affecting everybody, but on the margin, it's certainly pushing a certain number of people out to the suburbs. But we're gonna have to wait and see once we get through this pandemic, which I assume we will someday. And at that point, the big long lasting effect will be what's the impact on the tendency to work from home? Because I think part of it has been in big metropolitan areas, the costs of commuting are so high. But now if I can work 2 days from home, then maybe I'm willing further out and not face that commute every day. And I think that is here to stay. I think we've learned that we can work remotely. I think there's value to not being in our car or trains as much. So I think ultimately this will lead to greater decentralization just because housing costs are high and people like space and privacy. So, but we'll know better in 3 years, I think, once we get through this.
Yeah. On the issue of vouchers, I mean, housing choice vouchers or vouchers of some kind, essentially what seems to be the universally accepted solution to housing problems in the policy world. And throughout this webinar series, in every session, really, there have been a lot of suggestions about increasing how much we're spending on vouchers. What are your thoughts on the role of vouchers? And if there was a universal voucher, and of course the Biden campaign has supported a universal voucher, how much supply would that drive? Where wouldn't it drive supply? How much would you still have to subsidize or provide capital in some sense if everybody had a voucher? And generally, what are your thoughts on vouchers working? And also, you could suggest what your prognosis is as to the possibility that we would create a universal voucher.
Algernon, you want to start?
No, you should start.
There's a lot in there, Nan.
Yeah, sorry.
So I'll start with the last part first, because in some sense, because that's important, which is what's the prospects for a universal voucher program? If the Democrats would control both houses of the Congress and the presidency, I mean, I think there's a potential for great expansion of housing supports. I think the COVID pandemic has clearly highlighted the importance of home and the importance of having stable housing and affordable, decent housing, as had the issues around racial justice and the racial disparities in access to decent, affordable housing. And add to that the impacts of climate change and the fires and the hurricanes and the like. All those things I think are pointing to the fact that we need to have a much more robust national housing policy. So whether it's universal or just a great expansion, I do think, particularly under a Democratic administration, because I don't expect the Trump administration to continue. They haven't indicated that they're likely to do that, so it seems unlikely. Then the question would be on the table is, if we do get a great expansion of housing resources, how should we spend it? And as you say, I think the voucher is in many respects the simplest means of doing it, and it allows for people to choose in the market, but it presumes is that the market is supplying the housing that's needed. Now, if we suddenly goose demand by giving everybody or a lot of people access to a voucher in conditions that we have now, which is supply is fairly inelastic, particularly in high cost markets, it could just greatly exacerbate housing inflation in a way that will really undermine the value of those vouchers. So I think if we do expand housing resources, we really have to be careful in thinking about how will we structure that and have a balance of supply and demand side subsidies that would defer in some sense to local jurisdictions, states, to kind of diagnose what's happening in their area and how we need to balance those resources. I think vouchers, as you know, have the potential to open up people to opportunities in lots of communities. It hasn't lived up to that potential. Things like small area FMRs are intended to provide some more level playing field so that where housing is more expensive, you can get more support rather than a broad market area level rent setting. There's some indication in some places that has opened it up, but it often is dependent upon being associated with counseling and other services to help people be made aware of those opportunities. So we'd have to think about whether or not if we expand subsidies, are we also expanding supports for people to navigate those systems? You know, and I think we have to think about when and where does housing supply have benefits? And there's work that has showed that, in fact, tax credit developments in low-income communities have very positive externalities on surrounding communities, can help be a part of community revitalization efforts. On the other hand, we don't want to concentrate the poor in poor communities again, but by having supply in high-income communities or high communities of opportunity, we can make sure that there's always access to affordable housing in those communities. So I'm giving you a very roundabout answer, but what I would promote would be a balance of supply and demand, particularly in the markets that are supply constrained, and use supply thoughtfully, both as a community revitalization tool and as a way of expanding access into communities of opportunity where folks might otherwise have trouble entering.
Algernon, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I agree with what Chris has said. I do think that we should look at both the supply and demand. And in terms of supply, I do think that we should also look to social housing. So I'll say a little bit more about that. But getting back to a point that Chris sort of referenced, with housing vouchers, people, I mean, one of the hopes has been that it would lead to racial integration and class integration, and it has been limited in what it has done in that space. And that's a problem. I saw someone in the chat mention sources of income discrimination, and that's an issue. And it's an issue that you know, the Legal Defense Fund is paying attention to and working on. So I think we need to do more in trying to push the vouchers to realize, you know, to be what we hope that they would be in terms of trying to get them to work so that they foster both racial and class integration. So there's more work to be done there. In general, they are a good way of providing affordable housing, but I think another alternative, or in addition to, we should look to the social housing model, and the social housing model has the potential to move toward that racial and class integration within a housing unit, or within a housing complex, within a housing system. So one way you can do it, you can have integration, race and class integration, by taking people and moving them to other communities. But another alternative is to try to build a community that's race and class integrated. And I think the social housing model is a model that can be used to facilitate that. Like everything and around race and class in this country, it's going to be difficult, no doubt. But I think it's useful to do both. And the social housing model also will allow you to address the supply needs if there is a supply need in a particular community. So if there isn't sufficient housing for the poorest households, the social housing model would be a means to build that housing, and also build sufficient and provide the right incentives so that it's racially and class diverse. So yes, we should have more vouchers, but I think we should also look across the globe at the examples of the social housing models that we see.
Algernon, someone had a related question, Monica did, about the structural barriers that prevent U.S. public housing from maintaining its quality over time. So if you did do this social housing, what would stop it from deteriorating the way social housing, public housing has deteriorated in the U.S.?
Right. So when we built public housing, basically the real estate industry said, make sure it's not too nice. Make sure it can't compete with what we're offering, the private real estate industry. So that was one limitation, that it was like, make sure that it's not really good housing. So we shouldn't build public housing with that literally built into the design. The other problem, and this is why I talk about the social housing model, is by restricting the housing to the poorest of the poor. Well, this is the other problem. We restricted public housing to the poorest of the poor, and then said we only are going to use rents to do maintenance and upkeep. But if you're housing the poorest of the poor, you're not going to get any income to do maintenance and upkeep if you're restricting that as the pool for maintenance and upkeep. But when you have a much more diverse tenant base, a more diverse tenant pool, then economically, then you get more money in terms of rents that can support maintenance and upkeep. Again, but I think we also have to recognize this is a social good. We have to the government has to fund it. Getting back to where I started, the government has to fund it to make sure that it works. But what we've seen in other places is that when social housing sphere is large enough and diverse enough, it can actually be self-sustaining. So that's something that we can aspire to. But again, I do think that federal support is necessary. So our problem is the buildings were designed so that they're not the best, and then the funding mechanism were designed so that they are insufficient. So problems proceeded from that. So we have to remove those two constraints.
I can certainly speak from the experience of working with trying to get public housing maintenance money out of Congress for decades, which it seems like we've basically just given up on and let it and started tearing it down because we couldn't get that money, ever get enough money to keep up with the problem. One sec, I had some other questions here. They've gone somewhere. Algernon, someone was, oh no, that's the same question. There was a question from several people about if we started downsizing on housing, tiny homes, I guess that's basically smaller units, would that help with the affordable housing crisis?
One of those interesting facts that's often overlooked, if the Joint Center often talks about how many people are cost burden. I talked about it today, and by income level, but we don't talk about a lot is by household size. And if you look nationally at the share of people who are cost burden renters, something like 45% are single persons. And so, like the tax credit units tend to be 2-bedroom apartments. But what we really need to do is to produce a lot of housing that's for individuals, really, who will make up a large share in many markets of cost burden individuals. And so that lends itself to thinking about other forms of housing than just having everybody have their own independent apartment. Certainly, SROs as a means of providing people who are formerly homeless with housing has been a cost-effective ways. And we can think about that in more general terms about how do we provide more efficient housing. So maybe there is more shared communal spaces and the like as a way to bring those costs down, because kitchens and baths are a big part of the cost of producing a housing unit. So I think we ought to think about that. We have this conception in our head, everybody should have an apartment. An apartment consists of their own bathroom and own kitchen and a living room and a dining room and 2 bedrooms. And that costs a lot of money. And so if we have a problem, we don't have enough money, let's think about new forms of housing, which may also address issues around loneliness and isolation and other things as well. So we should be open to those models, whether it's tiny houses or however you want to think about it, but certainly co-housing of some form or some version of an SRO model.
Algernon, did you have any?
Yeah, no, I agree again. And I just recall seeing an article maybe a year or two ago about some community using tiny homes to address, I think it was to address homelessness among veterans. So I think people are exploring that and having success, at least in a limited fashion with that.
Yeah, it reminds me too, I think in the 60s and 70s, maybe not in the 70s, 50s and 60s, I think we had between 1 and 2 million units of SRO housing in the country, most of which is gone, and probably largely explains a lot of homelessness in the bigger cities, just that those units aren't available. Not only were they small, but they were also flexible with respect to paying the rent. So you could, people who had intermittent income, they could pay the rent for a night or for a week. They didn't have to come up with what you have to come up with now, $2,000 a month for a studio or 1-bedroom apartment every month. It's interesting. And also just to share that I think in the homelessness area, there's a lot of work being done on shared housing and how to match up people better as roommates and how to find housing that can be shared. And to your point, Chris, this also goes to the aging of the population, because often people who are older really don't want to be on their own in an apartment. They're concerned about that for health reasons. So
Right.
there's a lot, and yet I think the homeless system generally, the housing answer is that if you're going to house somebody, they're going to be in their own apartment. Someone raised a question about co-housing as well. Should we have a renter housing credit that's given directly to individuals that takes the tax side approach? What do you think of that idea?
In my sense of the challenge there is if the tenant has to pay rent every month, and you get a tax credit at the end of the year, it doesn't really help your cash flow issue. And the other issue is that so many low income renters may pay little or no income tax. They may be getting their earned income tax credit. So it has to be structured in a way that provides income over the course of the year, which I think has been challenging. I think my sense of that too is that it's Algernon made a strong case for why the low-income housing tax credit is not an ideal way or good way to provide housing subsidies. One reason why it has been so popular is because it's done through the tax code. So it's not an online budget item in Congress, and therefore it's not reviewed every year. So it's proven to be kind of more durable. And because it obviously has a lot of support through all the people who would benefit from that system of providing subsidies. The renter tax credit, I think, is a way of trying to say, well, can we also get an off-budget item into the system? And I think, as Algernon said, we just ought to own up and say we ought to pay for housing, and we should ought to provide a means that's much more operationally effective in doing that than through a tax credit, would be my, but there's politics here, that's not unimportant. So if the way to structure it and politically it makes it more defensible or more visible over time, then I'd be for it. But it's got some operational challenges, what I would say. Yeah.
Algernon, do you have thoughts on the tax credit?
No, Chris answered that perfectly. Yeah.
Okay. A lot of both the cost and the difficulty in getting affordable housing, and as you discussed in neighborhoods, sometimes wealthier neighborhoods, and sometimes just any neighborhood, is the pushback from the communities. And that drives up the cost and sometimes just stops you from doing it. Any thoughts about that? How that could be better addressed?
I think with that, I guess it is a real challenge, and it's such a deep challenge. I mean, that's why we're still struggling with racial segregation in housing and in schools so many years after the Brown decision. But I do think, as I was saying before, we need to make this a social issue. We need to make it an issue where communities have to explicitly take a stand and say which stand, where are we going to stand? And I don't think we have sufficiently made it a social issue that people feel compelled to address, that we've sort of pushed it aside. It's hard, and that's why we're still struggling with it today. But it is one of the key challenges, and I wish I had a better solution, a better answer. But all I can say is that we need to keep really elevate it and keep pushing.
I guess my
Yes.
2 cents on this would be, that if you think about this, land use policy is in our system of governments delegated to states, who then in turn delegated to local governments. So really, states need to take back this issue and say, this is an issue that has to do the provision of housing in communities across the state is something that's a higher level concern than it is at any individual jurisdiction, because individual jurisdictions will have a host of reasons why it's not in their interest to accept this housing. And so it really pushes pressure on states to take ownership of this issue. There are Mount Laurel in New Jersey, 40B in Massachusetts, California has some mandates as well at the state level. Those provide some models. They haven't been, I'm from Massachusetts, I think 40B has been fairly effective, but even there, over the span of nearly 50 years has led to about 60,000 housing units being built in communities, suburban communities that might not otherwise have been. 60,000 isn't nothing, but in the state of some 6 million, it's not a lot either. So I do think that one thing is that states have to really take ownership of this and recognize this as important social infrastructure. And it takes some political will, because the state is made up of legislators who come from those suburban areas who are going to be reluctant to vote on this too. So the other piece I would say is the federal government, who doesn't have a direct stake in land use, can create incentive structures through provision of federal transportation funding, federal housing dollars, or other infrastructure spending and the like that are tied to policies at the state level that create opportunities to build housing in a broader range of places. And you can structure that as carrots, saying there's a pot of money you can only get if you get access to it, or a stick and say you don't get federal highway money unless you have this. So that again will take leadership on this federal level, but those are 2 ways I think I would approach it: federal carrots and sticks through funding, and state mandates on localities to plan for this.
Right, and in that point, I remember that Senator Cory Booker had a proposal, a housing proposal.
That's true.
that linked kind of desegregation efforts to federal grant dollars. So yes, that is a good option.
When he was running in his campaign for president, I think he did. That's true. Well, so I have one, and we don't have terribly much time, but I have one final question for you, and that is, okay, the election is in whenever it is, 2 weeks from now. So if there was one thing that you would want to tell a new administration or a returning administration to do to address this gap in affordable housing, either on the supply or demand side, what would be the most impactful thing that you would tell them to do?
Well,
sorry for putting you on the spot.
Well, it's in my presentation. I would say let's move away from the low-income housing tax credit, but at minimum, put a comparable amount of money into vouchers and or social housing, at minimum.
Yeah, I think there's 2 buckets to really think about. One would be money, and the other would be, is there a way to free up supply of housing? I'm going to go back to what Algernon started with, which was this point that from the Urban Institute, saying there's just a big gap between what the cost to produce housing and what people can afford. And so I would just say, if we're going to provide people with decent affordable housing, particularly people at the lower end of the income distribution, we're going to have to provide subsidies. I would vote for making some sort of large, basically block grant program to states that would provide that funding with a mandate to then tailor the programs to fit their circumstances. The other way to go would be to try to free up supply of housing, but I think that's much more about moderate income, folks, than it is about the poorest households, which really where the problem is concentrated. So that would be my, write a check, and you have, because it's important for so many reasons to people's fundamental well-being, and it has, as you said, Nan, implications for housing, for healthcare, and for all other ways in which we would save money if we got people stably housed in decent housing.
Yes. Well, listen, we're perfect timing. We're at the hour. Thank you both so much. Just a really incredible discussion. So helpful, so fruitful. We deeply appreciate it. And so thank you for being here with us today, and thank all of you who are listening. And we'll be putting some pieces of these together and getting them on our website. So thanks so much, and take good care.
Thanks to you, Nan, for all you do. Really appreciate it. Enjoy.
Bye-bye. Enjoy, yes. Thank you, Joy.